call it the Dead Coast. I call it a mausoleum for souls. Welcome to Gull's Head Lighthouse, a finger of stone pointing defiantly into the North Atlantic, where the isolation isn't just physical. My name is Daniel Hale, a man haunted by a single moment, and I came here seeking penance, seeking oblivion. Instead, I found myself living by 3 strange rules just to survive the night. What's the loneliest place you've ever been? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're brave enough to keep watching Gull's Head, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell. Because out here, the sea doesn't just remember, it collects. The watch begins now. The Atlantic was a cold, gray beast the day I signed away 6 months of my life to Gull's Head Lighthouse. But it was the silence afterwards, the consuming, listening silence that truly began to devour me. The supply boat, a weathered trawler named Gannet, had already become a speck on the churning horizon, its diesel thrum a fading memory swallowed by the vast, indifferent roar of the surf against the jagged teeth of what the sparse locals called the Dead Coast. They said it with a peculiar emphasis, a finality that broke no argument. This stretch of Maine coastline had a habit of making things disappear, ships, men, hope. It had vanished from most modern maps, a forgotten splinter of land jutting defiantly into the unforgiving ocean. Gull's Head itself was a monument to that defiance, or perhaps to folly, a skeletal finger of granite, impossibly tall, crowned with the tarnished copper dome of the lantern room. It rose from a narrow, treacherous spit of land, accessible only by sea, or as I'd learned, by a perilous tide-dependent trek across slick, weed-choked rocks. The air here tasted of salt, damp stone, and something else, something faintly metallic and old, like rust or dried blood. It was a smell that settled deep in the lungs. My duffel bag, heavy with the few essentials I deemed necessary for a self-imposed exile, lay at my feet. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, tugged at my jacket, whispering insinuations I couldn't quite decipher. This was it. Penance. 6 months to confront the ghosts that had chased me from the Coast Guard, from my life, from the reflection in the mirror. The ghost of Aiden, my younger brother, his face, blue-lipped and wide-eyed with the shock of the icy Atlantic, was a permanent fixture in the dark theater of my mind. The feel of his hand, slick with freezing water, slipping from my grasp during that botched rescue. That was a sensation seared into my nerve endings. The crushing cold of that failure was a constant companion. A figure emerged from the shadowed doorway at the base of the tower. The departing keeper. He was ancient, wizened beyond what I guessed were his actual years. His skin the color and texture of old parchment stretched taut over sharp bones. His eyes, pale and watery, held the vast, empty loneliness of the sea itself. He smelled of brine, damp wool, and an underlying, unsettling hint of something subtly decaying, like wet leaves left too long in the dark. Why? He didn't offer a hand, just a curt nod. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raspy, as if worn thin by years of disuse or by shouting against the eternal wind. Hale, is it? Daniel Hale, yes, right. He gestured vaguely towards the tower. She's all yours, or you're all hers. Depends on the night. A dry, mirthless chuckle escaped him, like stones rattling in a tin can. He didn't wait for a reply, but turned, his movements stiff, and began to list the terms of my solitary watch, the rules that had been passed down, keeper to keeper, for God knew how long. 3 things you need to etch into your brain, Hale. Not suggestions. Gospel. He fixed me with that vacant stare, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not madness, but a profound, soul-deep weariness. First, the main beacon. He gestured upward. must remain lit from civil dusk till civil dawn without fail. Not even for a flicker, regardless of weather or visibility. Its flame is more than just a warning, it's a ward. Understand? I nodded, the word ward snagging uncomfortably in my thoughts. Second, he continued, his voice dropping, if you see her on the tidal rocks below, the one with the seaweed hair, and the bundled thing she carries, do not make eye contact, do not wave, do not signal. Close the landward shutters if you must, but never acknowledge her presence. She's looking for an invitation. His gaze flickered out to the turbulent water, then back, a shiver tracing its way down my spine despite the relative mildness of the day. He ignored me. Third, channel 113.7, on the old marine band in the watchroom. He tapped a temple with a gnarled finger. Should it crackle to life by itself, especially if it whispers your name or any name or pleads for entry, power it down immediately. Do not answer. Do not listen for longer than it takes to ensure silence. Some calls aren't meant to be received. He stared at me then, a long, unsettling moment, as if trying to impart the full weight of his grim knowledge through sheer force of will. Then, with another jerky nod, he turned and began the laborious trek towards the rocks, where the Gannet skiff would, with luck and timing, return for him at low tide. He offered no comfort, no further explanation, only the stark, unyielding burden of his warnings. My first night in Gull's Head was a descent into a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. The ancient tower groaned around me with every gust of wind, the stones sighing like a dying giant. Below, the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks was a constant, mournful heartbeat, a sound that promised no solace. As I stood my first watch in the lantern room, the massive Fresnel lens turning with hypnotic grace, its powerful beam slicing through the encroaching darkness, I scanned the perimeter. Far below, at the very edge of the light's sweeping caress, I thought I saw a flicker of movement on the glistening tidal rocks, an indistinct shape, tall and slender. I blinked, strained my eyes. Gone. Blinked, strained my eyes. Gone. A trick of the light, I told myself. A product of fatigue and the unnerving solitude. Yet, despite the steady burn of the great lamp, the air in the enclosed space around me grew colder than the outside temperature. A damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the Maine autumn. Later, before turning in, I found the official Lighthouse logbook open on the worn wooden desk in the small watchroom. His predecessor's last entry, penned in a shaky, spidery script, was stark. The tide pulls. She watches. Light guide them. Forgive me. The ink was still faintly damp, the words seeming to hover on the page, almost vibrating with an unspoken residual terror. Forgive who? For what? The question hung in the frigid air, unanswered. The day settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun, the tides, and the insatiable demands of the Gull's Head light. Dawn brought the ritual of extinguishing the great lamp, cleaning the colossal lens of salt spray and insect remains, checking the fuel levels for the diesel generator housed in a small stone outbuilding. The generator itself was a temperamental beast, its rhythmic chug and cough a constant, mechanical counterpoint to the natural sounds of the dead coast. Dusk reversed the process, the lighting of the lamp a small act of defiance against the encroaching gloom. This monotony became my shield, a fragile defense against the memories of Aiden, against the gnawing dread that seemed to seep from the very stones of the tower. But the dead coast had its own ways of breaching such defenses. Sounds carried strangely across the desolate, windswept landscape. The wind itself, whistling through the cracks in the ancient stonework, often seemed to coalesce into whispers that almost formed Aiden's name. The cry of a distant gull would sometimes morph, just for an instant, into a sound too much like a human sob, sharp and forlorn. Then came the first true test, a squall, unforecasted and violent, blew in from the northeast, hammering Gull's Head with horizontal rain and gale-force winds. I was in the lantern room, watching the beam dutifully slice through the tempest, when the diesel generator in the outbuilding sputtered, coughed a plume of greasy black smoke, visible even through the downpour, and then died. The great light flickered, dimmed, flickered again, threatening to extinguish completely. An abnormal surge of visceral panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me, far exceeding mere concern for duty or the integrity of the equipment. It was a primal fear, raw and suffocating. In those seconds, the light faltered, the temperature in the lantern room plummeted. A cloying, suffocating smell of deep ocean, something ancient and profoundly rotten, filled the enclosed space, making me gag. I scrambled, heart hammering, towards the emergency ignition, my hands clumsy with a terror I couldn't name, with a prayer I didn't know I possessed. I got the backup system running, and the light flared back to its full, unwavering intensity. The foul smell receded, the unnatural cold lessened, but the memory of that bone-chilling fear remained. The ward, I thought, my predecessors were echoing. The Sea Woman, as I'd come to call her in my own mind, made her next appearance a few nights later. It was in the pre-dawn gloom, that liminal space between night and day, when the world seems to hold its breath. I was checking the horizon through a rain-lashed window in the watchroom when I saw her, closer this time, standing on a lower shelf of rock, waves churning white around her ankles. She was tall, impossibly gaunt, her dark, lank hair matted with what looked like seaweed, plastered to a skeletal, bone-white face. The bundled thing she clutched to her chest was a sodden, indistinct mass, shapeless and still. Her silence, even from that distance, was more terrifying than any scream could have been. I felt a primal urge to look directly at her face, to try and understand, but his predecessor's warning screamed in my mind, "Do not make eye contact. She's looking for an invitation." With a gasp, I wrenched my gaze away, stumbling back from the window, my hand flying up to slam the heavy wooden landward shutter closed. My heart hammered against my ribs, the image of her seared into my retinas. Invitation to what? The old Bakelite Marine Band radio, a relic from a bygone era, sat silently on a shelf in the watchroom. Until one evening, it didn't. I was brewing a cup of instant coffee, the only sound the hiss of the propane stove and the eternal wind, when it crackled to life, unbidden. The dial was set to a dead channel, or so I'd thought. Static, sharp and spitting then through the noise, a garbled, pleading voice, laced with the unmistakable hiss of seawater and wind. Lost. So cold. Help us. It was faint, distant, like a transmission from the edge of the world, or beyond. My blood ran cold. Rule 3. Channel 113.7. Power it down immediately. With a jolt of adrenaline, I lunged for the radio and slammed the power switch down. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and deeply accusatory, as if the very air around me was holding its breath, waiting. A few days later, searching for spare wicks in a damp, forgotten storage locker at the base of the tower, my hand brushed against something tucked behind a loose stone in the curving wall. It was an old nautical chart, rolled tight and stained with salt and mildew. Carefully, I unrolled it. It depicted the waters around Gull's Head with an archaic hand-drawn detail. What made my breath catch was the sheer number of wreck sites marked with small inked crosses. Dozens of them, far more than any official modern chart would show. One, larger than the others, directly off the treacherous shoals south of the lighthouse, was circled in faded red ink. Beside it, a spidery annotation. Herald of Dawn, Lost All Souls, Nov, 1888. The year sent a shiver through me. The year of the great blizzards. And the name, Herald of Dawn. It felt familiar, like a half-remembered line from a dream or a nightmare. The psychological strain of Gull's head began to tighten its grip. Sleep became a precious, fleeting commodity, haunted by vivid, recurring nightmares. Aiden was always there, his small hand slipping from mine in the churning, dark water, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. I'd wake with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat, the roar of the phantom ocean still in my ears. The line between those nightmares and my waking hours started to fray. With the fleeting shadows I glimpsed in my peripheral vision, the sudden cold spots that drifted through rooms like pockets of unseen ice. Real? Or was I succumbing to the infamous Lighthouse madness I'd read about? My mind unraveling under the triple assault of isolation, guilt, and sleep deprivation. The sea woman became a more frequent, more brazen visitor. Each time she was closer to the base of the lighthouse itself, appearing with the incoming high tide as if born from the churning foam. I started to notice more detail, or perhaps my fear was supplying it. The seaweed in her lank hair seemed to writhe with a life of its own. The bundle she clutched so fiercely, I could almost make out the suggestion of skeletal fingers, impossibly small, emerging from the sodden rags. Sometimes I was certain I saw it twitch with a faint internal movement, or heard a sound like a mewling kitten, quickly swallowed by the wind. Even when I wasn't looking, when I kept my back resolutely to the seaward windows, I felt her gaze like icy needles on my skin, a constant, silent, and terribly patient pressure. The unexplained occurrences inside the lighthouse escalated. Tools I'd left in one specific spot in the lantern room would be moved, sometimes just by inches, sometimes to another level entirely. A faint, pervasive, briny scent, sharp and unsettling, began to cling to my bunk, no matter how often I aired the bedding. The heavy, iron-bound trapdoor, leading to the tower's dank lower levels, a place I avoided, would sometimes be found creaking open on its own in the dead of night, revealing only an impenetrable, listening blackness below. I started talking to myself, muttering reassurances, then would catch myself, a cold, hard knot of fear tightening in my gut. I was following my predecessor's path, his vacant eyes and raspy voice a grim portent of my own future. Channel 113.7, the damp radio. It activated again one storm-lashed afternoon, the static sharper this time, more aggressive. First, a sound like a child crying, a heartbreaking, desolate sound that twisted something deep inside me. Then it morphed, the voice changing, becoming masculine, desperate, distorted by static and what sounded like howling wind. Captain Merrick, the name formed in my mind with chilling certainty. Mayday! Mayday! Herald of Dawn taking on water. We are breaking up. The light. Where's the blasted light? The anguish in that phantom voice was palpable. And then a whisper. So close, so intimate, it sounded like it was right there in the room with me, inches from my ear. Daniel, let us in. Aiden is waiting. I cried out, a raw, involuntary sound, and ripped the power cord from the wall socket. My mouth ripped the power cord from the wall socket, hand trembling so violently I could barely hold it. The silence that crashed down was a physical blow, driven by a desperate need for answers, for anything to anchor my fraying sanity. I tore apart the small watchroom behind a loose floorboard, beneath a stack of old mildewed signal flags. My fingers closed on something solid. A journal. Not the official log, and clearly not belonging to my immediate predecessor. This one was ancient, its leather cover cracked and warped by damp, the paper brittle and foxed with age. The ink was faded, the handwriting an archaic, spidery script. With trembling hands, I began to read. Entries spoke of her insatiable hunger, of the terrible price of the light, of a long-dead keeper who had spoken to the drowned ones, and, in his loneliness and madness, had foolishly invited them ashore to warm by his fire. The entries grew more erratic, more terrified. The last legible one, dated over a century ago, was chillingly simple. She knows my name now. The sea always claims its due. The intricate clockwork mechanism of the great Fresnel lens, the very heart of Gull's Head, began to seriously malfunction. Its smooth, ponderous rotation became erratic, jerky, sometimes stopping altogether for terrifying seconds before lurching back into motion. The powerful beam, once a piercing white spear, dimmed to a sickly flickering yellow. I did what I could with my limited knowledge and the sparse tools available, but it was clear this was beyond a simple fix. I radioed the mainland on a secure, thankfully silent channel, requesting immediate technical assistance. A few days later, battling rough, slate-gray seas, the supply boat, the Gannet, appeared on the horizon. It brought fuel, meager rations, and an unexpected passenger, Thomas Greaves, a lighthouse technician, ostensibly sent from the regional depot to repair the failing light. Greaves was at first a startling and almost welcome intrusion. He was in his mid-40s, perhaps, with an easy smile and a ready stream of talk that seemed to push back against the oppressive silence of Gull's Head. His charm, however, felt a little too polished, a little too practiced for a man presumably used to solitary technical work. He carried a faint, persistent scent, a curious mixture of metallic oil, old copper, and something else. Something that reminded me of stale sea salt, like clothes left damp for too long. He expressed a rehearsed sympathy about Gull's Head's grim reputation, even shared a few local tales of shipwrecks and strange happenings, his details a little too vivid, a little too knowing for casual folklore. Almost immediately, Greaves showed an unnervingly keen, almost obsessive interest in my experiences. He'd find me in the watchroom, or appear silently at my elbow in the lantern room, his questions casual but relentlessly probing. About the sea woman. Seen anything unusual out there, Hale? On the rocks, maybe? About the radio anomalies? This old rig playing tricks on you? They say the salt air does strange things to electronics and to minds. He'd ask how I was holding up under the strain, his gaze lingering a moment too long. He asked about the rules, not directly challenging them, but circling them, testing their boundaries in conversation. Sometimes these old systems need a complete reset, you know, he said one afternoon, tapping the housing of the damaged lens mechanism. Even the rules, especially the rules, got to be flexible in a place like this. A new layer of unease settled over me. I began to feel observed, not just by the ever-present sea and its spectral inhabitant, but by Greaves himself. He had a disconcerting habit of appearing silently, as if materializing from the shadows of the tower. I'd turn, and he'd just be there, watching me with that placid, unreadable expression. The already blurred line between my waking reality and my sleep-deprived nightmares began to fray even further. Sometimes, in the dim, flickering light of the emergency lanterns we now relied on more often, I'd see Greaves' features momentarily shift, sharpen, his eyes reflecting the churning gray of the sea outside, much like I imagined hers did. Aiden's ghostly whispers, which had become a grim soundtrack to my solitude, now seemed to merge at times with Greaves' placating, reasonable voice, creating a disorienting, terrifying internal cacophony that made it hard to distinguish one from the other. One evening, Greaves was tinkering with the ruined marine radio, claiming he might be able to salvage some parts. "Just checking the frequency crystal," he murmured, his back to me. The dial spun, then stopped. Channel 113.7. Before I could react, before I could shout the warning that clawed at my throat, a sound filled the small room. Not static this time. A voice, Clear, achingly sweet. A child's voice, singing a fragment of a lullaby my mother used to sing to Aiden, one I hadn't heard in 20 years. My breath hitched, my blood turning to ice. The singing stopped, and then a whisper, full of a child's innocent, heartbreaking sorrow, filled the silence. Aiden is so cold, Danny, so lonely. Let him come home to you. Reeves spun around, an expression of feigned alarm on his face. Good Lord. What was that? Strange interference on these old sets, eh? He quickly switched the radio off, but as he turned away, I caught the briefest flicker of something in his eyes. A strange predatory light, gleaming in the gloom, and a cold certainty settled in my stomach. This was no accident. The storm hit Gull's Head not as a gradual escalation, but as a sudden malevolent entity. One moment, the sea was a heaving gray menace. The next, it was a black, screaming apocalypse, rain driven horizontal by winds that shrieked like 1,000 tortured souls, hammered the ancient stone of the tower, each gust threatening to rip it from its foundations. The very air became a weapon. Lightning, not in sporadic flashes, but in continuous, blinding sheets, illuminated a world gone mad. Waves the size of buildings exploding against the rocks. Foam and spray flung hundreds of feet into the air. The lighthouse itself, an insignificant speck in a maelstrom of cosmic fury. And then, with a final protesting groan, a shower of sparks from the ravaged control panel. The emergency lanterns we'd been relying on died. The great Fresnel lens, already crippled, gave one last, sickly yellow flicker and was extinguished. We were plunged into an absolute, terrifying darkness, a blackness so profound it felt like being swallowed whole. The only illumination came from the hellish, strobing lightning, each flash a grotesque snapshot of chaos. It was in this roaring, lightless crucible that Greaves confronted me. We were in the lantern room, the highest point of the tower, the wind trying to tear the copper dome from its moorings. His charming facade already cracking, shattered completely in the stark glare of a lightning flash. I saw his face, no longer placid or friendly, but contorted with a desperate predatory intelligence, his eyes wide and manic, burned with an unnatural reflected light, the light of the storm, or something far older, far colder. You still don't understand, do you, Hale? He screamed over the cacophony, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the storm. You think these rules, this light, this wretched rock, you think it's about warning ships? Another flash illuminated his wild grin. It's about payment! It's always been about payment. He lunged, not with the clumsiness of a technician, but with a surprising wiry strength. I stumbled back, crashing against the cold iron railing that encircled the lens housing. The Herald of Dawn! He shrieked, his face inches from mine, spittle flying. I was on her, Hale, a passenger, trying to escape my own pathetic life, when she started to break up on those shoals, when the sea came for us all. I made a bargain. Lightning seared the sky again, and in that instant, I saw her, the sea woman, not on the rocks below, but here, somehow coalesced from the storm itself, pressed against the thick glass of the lantern room, her face a mask of skeletal fury, seaweed hair lashing like Medusa's snakes, her black eyes pits of infinite cold hunger, and the bundle in her arms. It wasn't shapeless anymore. In the ghastly light, I saw the distinct, horrifying outline of a small, still form, swaddled in rotting fabric. She offered me a choice. Greaves roared, his grip like iron on my arm. My life. For the light. For the keepers who would follow. A soul for the sea. Hale. A constant vigil. I am the keeper from that journal. I am the one who sealed the pact. And I've waited decades. Decaying decades. for someone like you. Someone broken enough. Someone with enough darkness in them to understand the bargain, to willingly take my place. The radio on the floor, a melted ruin, inexplicably crackled to life, not with static, but with a chorus of voices, screaming, pleading, gurgling, the sounds of 100 souls drowning in icy water, the death knell of the herald of dawn. And through it all, a clear, piercing cry, "Aiden, Aiden, help me." My brother's voice, perfect and terrified. Greaves shoved me towards the ruined lamp mechanism. The rules, Hale. They're not to keep them out. They're to keep the keeper in, to ensure the sacrifice continues. Extinguish the last ember of hope. Speak her name. Invite your brother home. One simple act, and you can rest. I can rest. He was mad, utterly, terrifyingly mad, empowered by the storm, by the monstrous presence at the window, my Coast Guard training, the years of discipline, the ingrained instinct to act in a crisis, surged through the fog of terror. He wanted me to break a rule willingly. He needed my consent, my surrender. The sea woman's face was inches from the glass, her lipless mouth gaping in a silent scream, her eyes fixed on me. The illusion of Aiden drowning, begging, flashed before my eyes, a desperate, wrenching appeal. "He's gone," I screamed, the words torn from my throat, raw with a grief I'd carried for too long. "You're not him. You're a lie. You're a lie. This whole place is a lie." I grabbed the emergency flare gun from its holster on the wall, the one I'd checked and rechecked daily, not to signal. Greaves lunged, thinking I was surrendering to madness. But I wasn't aiming it out to sea. I spun, jamming the barrel against the sodden, rotting bundle the sea woman clutched to her chest through the thick glass. "This isn't my brother," I roared, and pulled the trigger. The flare ignited with a blinding magnesium-white flash, even through the glass. The sea woman shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, a sound that was the tearing of ancient fabric, the grinding of seabed rock, the effigy in her arms. For that's what it was, a grotesque, barnacle-encrusted mockery of a child, perhaps Greaves' own lost innocence or the first soul the sea had claimed from him, erupted in an unnatural, spectral flame. The sea woman recoiled from the glass, her form flickering, her shriek swallowed by a colossal thunderclap that shook the tower to its core. Greaves screamed, clutching his head, his eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed even my own. "No, the Pact! It's not fulfilled." Lightning struck the very top of the copper dome above us. The world went white, then black. I awoke to a profound, ringing silence, punctuated only by the drip of water and the distant, exhausted sigh of the receding storm. Dawn, or what passed for it, was a sickly gray light filtering through the grime-streaked, cracked panes of the lantern room. My head throbbed, my body ached with 1,000 bruises, and the acrid smell of burnt flare, powder, and ozone stung my nostrils. Gull's Head had survived, battered, scarred, but still standing. The lantern room was a wreck. The magnificent Fresnel lens was a spider web of fractured glass, shards littering the floor like fallen stars. The copper dome above was buckled and torn, open to the weeping sky. Greaves was gone, vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace except for the faint, lingering scent of brine, rust, and the peculiar, underlying odor of profound decay that had always clung to him. Had the sea reclaimed him? Had the broken pact consumed him? Had the broken pact consumed him? I didn't know. And a part of me, the part that was still numb with shock, didn't care. The sea woman, too, had retreated with the tide and the dying storm. The oppressive weight was still there, perhaps even heavier, more ancient. But the acute, predatory edge had lessened, replaced by a vast, sorrowful emptiness. I was alone, utterly, Terrifyingly alone. The radio was a melted slag of bakelite and wire. The emergency beacon, the secondary light, was a twisted ruin, a victim of the lightning strike. My gaze fell upon the floor near where Greaves had last stood, a small, leather-bound notebook, similar to the ancient journal I'd found, but newer, its pages filled with Greaves' cramped, spidery handwriting. It must have fallen from his pocket during our struggle. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. His final entries, scrawled in the days before and during the storm, were a descent into madness and desperation, but they also contained a horrifying clarity. He hadn't just been trying to escape a personal torment. The Pact was more complex, more insidious. Gull said he'd written was a seal, a focal point. It demanded a conscious, willing, or tricked keeper to maintain a precarious balance, a kind of psychic dam against the ancient, hungry entities of the dead coast. Without that sentinel, without the ward of the light and the will behind it, those forces would eventually bleed out, their influence spreading beyond the Cursurals. Greaves wasn't just passing on a burden. He was trying to prevent something far worse. He was a monster, yes, but perhaps also a tragic, necessary one. A grim, newfound resolve, forged in the heart of the storm's fury, began to solidify within me. My guilt over Aiden, while still a raw wound, was no longer a crippling, passive weight. It was a cold, hard motivator. He was gone. I was still here, and Gull's Head, it seemed, still had a purpose, however terrible. Using salvaged lamp oil, driftwood I'd painstakingly collected for the stove, and the last of my waterproof matches, I built a small primitive signal fire on the narrow, exposed walkway outside the lantern room. The effort was immense, draining my last reserves of physical and emotional strength. As the thin plume of smoke began to rise into the bruised dawn sky, I looked out at the gray, indifferent ocean. The watch, it seemed, was not yet over. Days later, or was it weeks, time had lost its sharp edges. The distant thrum of an engine finally broke the monotonous sigh of the sea. A Coast Guard cutter, a sleek, modern vessel that looked utterly out of place against the archaic ruin of Gull's Head, cautiously approached. They'd been alerted by a passing fishing boat, its crew reporting a strange, erratic light. My desperate signal fire from the direction of the long-abandoned lighthouse. My story, when I tried to tell it, was a fractured, unbelievable mess of storms. Ghosts, a spectral woman, and a man named Thomas Greaves, who, according to their records, had never been officially assigned to Gull's Head for any repair. I was medically evacuated, diagnosed with severe exposure, exhaustion, and profound psychological shock. Greaves, if he was ever truly there, was officially listed as lost at sea during the unprecedented storm, likely a trespasser or squatter caught in its fury. The official Coast Guard report would cite catastrophic structural damage to Gull's Head and recommend the ancient tower be permanently decommissioned, its ruins dynamited, and left to the relentless mercy of the elements, a hazard to navigation. Months passed. I found myself in a sterile, quiet room, undergoing therapy, attempting to reintegrate into a world that now felt muted, distant, unreal. The bustling sounds of the city, the casual conversations, the everyday concerns of ordinary life. They all seemed like transmissions from a foreign planet. The sea, however, never truly left me. I smelled salt on inland breezes miles from the coast. I heard the phantom crash of waves in the dead of night, even in my landlocked apartment. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch her gaunt reflection in a dark window pane, her seaweed hair swaying gently, her black eyes fixed on me with that eternal, sorrowful hunger. The consuming fire of guilt over Aiden had changed. It was no longer a raging inferno threatening to incinerate my sanity. It had cooled, solidified into a deep, sorrowful acceptance, a permanent scar on my soul. But now, It was overlaid with a new, colder, more insidious dread. The chilling knowledge of Gull's Head, of what dwelled in the lightless depths off the dead coast, and the terrible, unending watch that someone somehow had to keep. I found myself drawn back, not physically at first, but in my thoughts, in my research. I learned that the official plans to demolish Gull's Head had been stalled, mired in bureaucratic red tape, and strangely, protests from a newly formed, privately funded historical preservation society with anonymous backers. The story ends not with a scream, but with a quiet, chilling acceptance. A year later, I am older, grayer, my eyes holding a familiar haunted emptiness, the kind I'd once seen in my predecessor. I stand on a lonely, windswept stretch of the Maine coastline, miles from Gull's Head, yet inextricably bound to it. I've purchased a small, powerful telescope. Each night as dusk bleeds into darkness, I train it on that distant, skeletal silhouette against the bruised horizon. Sometimes I think I see a faint, flickering light in its ruined lantern room. In my pocket, I carry a cheap, handheld marine radio. It's always tuned to channel 113.7. Most nights, there is only static, but sometimes very faintly, almost inaudibly, I hear whispers. A child's sorrowful song, a desperate garbled plea for help, or the soft, rhythmic crash of waves. Even when the air around me is still, the watch continues, because the sea always claims its due, and someone always has to listen. Gull's Head Lighthouse stands as a silent witness to the depths of the dead coast. Daniel Hale learned that some burdens are heavier than any storm. The rules were meant to contain the horror, but the sea always claims its due. The light may flicker, but the watch is eternal. Seriously, if you didn't stay until the very end, you missed the ultimate revelation, the twist that reveals the true, terrifying scope of Gull's Head's reach. The last few moments change everything. What do you think the Sea Woman is? What was Greaves's true pact? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you made it through the night at Gull's Head, if the sea hasn't claimed you, then you're already a part of our story. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some places, they never truly let you go. And the call is always listening.